Sterling dismissed the homeless man with practiced contempt. One photograph shattered 30 years of certainty. The trembling fingers, the worn edges, the faces in that image. His father's smile beside a boy Sterling never knew existed. Frank O'Connor wasn't begging for change. He was reclaiming a birthright that had been buried in silence and adoption papers. The fortune Sterling built his identity upon belonged to a ghost made flesh. This wasn't about money. This was about the acknowledgement Sterling had spent his entire life hoarding for himself. Now a stranger with his father's eyes was asking for the one thing Sterling couldn't afford to give. Subscribe to witness the reckoning. Bram, the Chapter 1, The Architecture of Superiority. The restaurant hummed with the carefully orchestrated ambience of wealth in motion. Sterling sat at his usual corner table, the one with the perfect angle to observe the entire room while maintaining the illusion of privacy. His fingers moving across the screen of his phone with the rhythmic precision of a conductor leading an invisible orchestra. The lighting here was designed to flatter without being obvious about it, casting shadows that made everyone look like they belonged in the carefully curated world of success and influence. He'd chosen this place deliberately, not just for the food, though the chef had 3 Michelin stars and an ego to match, but for what it represented, the unspoken declaration that he had arrived and remained in a stratosphere most people could only glimpse from below. The leather of the booth held him like an embrace of affirmation, every texture in this space whispering that he deserved to be here, that his presence was not just accepted, but expected. The waiter approached with the kind of silent deference Sterling had grown accustomed to, placing the wine glass at exactly the right distance, the temperature perfect, the pour measured with mathematical precision. Sterling barely acknowledged the gesture, his attention already divided between the quarterly reports glowing on his tablet and the conversation happening 3 tables away, where a rival executive was dining with someone who looked suspiciously like a board member from a company Sterling had been circling for months. Information flowed through spaces like this, the way water found cracks in stone, and Sterling had built his empire on the ability to notice what others overlooked, to position himself at the intersection of opportunity and timing. His father had taught him that, though the old man had framed it differently, speaking in parables about vision and legacy, rather than the cold calculus of competitive advantage. The memory of his father arrived uninvited, as it often did in quiet moments, bringing with it the familiar mixture of reverence and the gnawing pressure to prove that the succession had been the right choice. Outside the tall windows, Chicago sprawled in its evening transformation, the city lights beginning their nightly performance against the deepening sky. Sterling had always loved this view, this sense of being elevated above the chaos of streets and crowds, looking down on the world from a position of earned altitude. He'd grown up in this city, watched it from different angles as his family's fortune lifted him higher and higher. From the modest house in Oak Park where his mother had raised him alone after his father's long absences became permanent separations, to the penthouse he now owned in the Loop, where silence cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. The trajectory of his life felt inevitable in retrospect, each phase building naturally toward this moment, this version of himself who commanded rooms without raising his voice, and made decisions that rippled through markets and lives. Yet lately, in the spaces between meetings and mergers, a peculiar emptiness had been growing, a sense that the architecture of his success was somehow incomplete. His phone vibrated with an incoming message from his assistant, reminding him about the Foundation Gala next week, the annual performance where wealth dressed up as charity, and everyone pretended that writing checks absolved them of the methods they'd used to fill those accounts in the first place. Sterling had perfected the art of philanthropic theatre, knowing exactly which causes to support, which photographs to allow, which speeches to deliver with just the right balance of humility and pride. His father's name was carved into buildings across this city, monuments to generosity that obscured the ruthless efficiency with which the old man had accumulated the fortune he later distributed in carefully calculated portions. Sterling had studied those choices, understanding that legacy was not about how you made the money, but about who remembered you and why. He would exceed his father's achievements, build something that couldn't be reduced to bronze plaques and endowed chairs, create a name that would outlive the buildings and the foundations. The first course arrived, presented with artistic precision that bordered on parody, each element placed with tweezers and intention, the sauce forming abstract patterns that would disappear in moments. Sterling appreciated the craft without being moved by it, recognizing that even beauty at this level was transactional, designed to justify the prices and maintain the mythology of exclusivity. He tasted the food with the detachment of someone who'd eaten in too many restaurants like this. The flavors technically perfect, but somehow failing to register as nourishment. Merely fuel processed by a body that had learned to function on minimal sleep and maximum efficiency. Across the room, laughter erupted from a table of younger executives, their voices carrying that particular pitch of confidence that came from being on the ascent, still hungry enough to believe that reaching the summit would satisfy the appetite. Sterling remembered that hunger before it had been replaced by something colder and more sustainable. The door to the restaurant opened, admitting a draft of outside air and a figure that immediately registered as out of place. A disruption in the carefully maintained equilibrium of the room. Sterling noticed him peripherally at first, the way one notices a discordant note in familiar music, his attention pulled by the sudden shift in the atmosphere as conversations paused and gazes flickered toward the entrance. The man was dressed in layers that spoke of seasons lived outdoors, his appearance carrying the unmistakable markers of homelessness that made him visible in the way society usually worked to keep invisible. The hostess moved quickly to intercept him, her professional smile replaced by something harder, her body language creating a barrier between the street and the sanctuary of the dining room. Sterling watched with the cold interest of someone observing a problem being efficiently resolved, already returning his attention to his phone, assuming the situation would be handled according to the unspoken protocols that kept spaces like this protected from unwanted realities. Chapter 2: The Approach of Ghosts. The homeless man moved through the restaurant with a determination that overrode the hostess's attempts at redirection. His eyes scanning the room with an intensity that suggested purpose rather than confusion, as if he were searching for something specific among the tables of affluent diners. Sterling felt the approach before he saw it, that animal awareness of being observed that survives beneath all the civilized veneers, the primitive alarm system that recognizes when one has become prey rather than predator. He looked up from his phone to find the man standing at the edge of his table, close enough that Sterling could smell the accumulated evidence of life lived without shelter. That mixture of weather and unwashing that made comfortable people recoil. The man was older than Sterling had initially assessed, perhaps in his 60s, with a face that bore the particular erosion of prolonged exposure and disappointment, lines carved deep by sun and circumstance, eyes that held something that didn't match the exterior wreckage of his appearance. "Mr. Sterling," the man said, and the use of his name transformed this from a random encounter into something more troubling, an intrusion that carried knowledge and intention. Sterling's first response was anger, the reflexive indignation of someone whose privacy had been violated, whose carefully controlled environment had been compromised by forces that should have been filtered out by security and social barriers. He glanced around the restaurant, noting the attention their interaction was drawing. The way other diners had paused their conversations to watch this drama unfold, witnesses to what should have been a private humiliation. The man stood there with a kind of weary patience, as if he'd expected resistance, as if he'd rehearsed this moment enough times to know how it would begin. Sterling felt the familiar machinery of dismissal engaging, the practiced efficiency with which he dealt with interruptions and inconveniences, the cold authority he'd cultivated specifically for moments like this. "I don't know how you know my name," Sterling said, his voice low but carrying the edge of threat. "But you need to leave. Now." The words came out with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent years issuing commands and expecting immediate compliance, each syllable designed to establish hierarchy and restore order. The man didn't move, didn't show the expected signs of intimidation or retreat, and that stillness registered as something more dangerous than aggression, a kind of resolution that couldn't be bullied or bought. Sterling felt a flicker of something beneath his anger, a sensation he couldn't immediately name, the way one feels when standing on ground that seems solid but isn't. The restaurant staff were approaching now, management converging to handle the situation, to remove this element that didn't belong, to protect their clientele from the uncomfortable reminder of everything their prices were meant to keep at bay. "I'm not here to make trouble," the man continued, his voice carrying a quality that didn't match his appearance, an educated cadence that suggested he hadn't always been what he now seemed to be, that the distance he'd fallen might be measured in more than just economic terms. "I just need 5 minutes of your time. 5 minutes, and then I'll leave." Sterling felt the weight of the room's attention pressing against him, the social calculus of the moment presenting impossible choices. Cause a scene by having security forcibly remove this person, or grant him the requested audience and risk whatever manipulation or scheme was being deployed. The man reached slowly into the tattered layers of his coat, moving with deliberate caution, as if aware that any sudden gesture might provoke a violent response. And Sterling felt his body tense, preparing for threat, his mind racing through scenarios of danger and disruption. What the man pulled from his coat wasn't a weapon, but something potentially more destructive. A photograph, worn at the edges from handling, protected in a plastic sleeve that suggested it had been carried as something precious, something worth preserving through circumstances that destroyed everything else. He placed it on the table between them with the careful reverence of someone presenting evidence, a single gesture that transformed the entire encounter from nuisance into mystery. Sterling looked down at the image despite himself, his eyes drawn by curiosity and the implicit challenge of what was being offered. The photograph showed 2 figures, one clearly recognizable despite the passage of decades, the unmistakable features of Sterling's father as a much younger man, perhaps in his early 30s, standing with his arm around a boy of maybe 5 or 6, both smiling with the unguarded joy that belonged to a world before complications arrived. Sterling's breath caught in his throat, his carefully maintained composure cracking as he stared at the image that shouldn't exist, at this impossible evidence of a reality he'd never known. His father stood there, frozen in time, looking at the boy with an expression Sterling had seen in other photographs, the one reserved for family, for blood, for the kind of love that society recognized and validated. But this boy wasn't Sterling, wasn't his mother, wasn't anyone Sterling had ever heard mentioned in the carefully curated mythology of his family history. The child in the photograph had his father's features in miniature, the same shape to the eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw, genetic echoes that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Sterling felt the ground shifting beneath his certainty, felt the architecture of his understanding beginning to reveal cracks he'd never suspected, fissures that threatened to spread and destabilize everything he'd built his identity upon. "My name is Frank O'Connor," the man said quietly, letting the photograph speak louder than any words could, watching Sterling's face with an expression that mixed hope and resignation, as if this moment had been rehearsed but never quite believed possible. "And before you send me away, before you call security and have me thrown into the street like trash, you should know that the boy in that photograph is me, your father's son, which makes me your brother." The words hung in the air between them, impossibly heavy, transforming the restaurant into a theater where reality itself was being rewritten, where the past was refusing to stay buried beneath the convenient fictions families tell themselves. Sterling looked from the photograph to the man claiming this impossible kinship, searching for the resemblance that would prove or disprove the claim. Finding it in details he wished he could unsee: the shape of the hands, the particular angle of the cheekbones, the genetic signature that whispered of shared origins, even as every instinct screamed that this couldn't be true. Der Stil, Chapter 3. The Shattering of Certainties. Sterling's world contracted to the space between himself and the photograph, everything else falling away into irrelevance as his mind struggled to process information that contradicted every narrative he'd constructed about his family and his place within it. His father had been a singular figure in his life, larger than circumstance, a man whose presence had defined success and whose approval had been the currency Sterling spent his entire existence trying to earn. The idea that this towering figure had maintained a secret of this magnitude, that there existed an entire human being his father had loved and then abandoned, felt like discovering that the earth beneath his feet had always been hollow. Sterling reached for the photograph with trembling fingers, lifting it closer to examine the details, searching for evidence of manipulation or fraud, desperate for this to be an elaborate con rather than truth. But the image had the authentic grain of old film stock, the subtle degradation that came from decades of existence, and his father's face was undeniably his father's face, captured in an unguarded moment of genuine affection. "This can't be real," Sterling said, the words emerging as desperate denial rather than confident dismissal, his voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't revealed in years, not since childhood. Not since learning that weakness was something predators could smell and exploit. Frank O'Connor nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response, as if he'd lived through enough variations of disbelief to recognize it as a necessary stage of processing impossible information. The man pulled out a chair and sat without invitation, the gesture somehow not presumptuous but inevitable, as if the revelation had earned him the right to occupy space at Sterling's table, to exist within the protected sphere of Sterling's attention. Sterling should have protested, should have maintained the boundaries that separated his world from chaos, but the photograph had shattered his capacity for normal responses, leaving him exposed and uncertain in ways he'd spent decades learning to avoid. "I know this is a shock," Frank said, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness, as if he recognized that he was inflicting damage despite the necessity of truth. "I didn't plan to tell you like this, to ambush you in a public place, but you're a difficult man to reach through normal channels, Mr. Sterling. Your assistants have assistants, and none of them let messages through from people like me." There was no accusation in the observation, just a statement of structural reality, the acknowledgement that the walls Sterling had built around himself served their purpose of keeping unwanted elements at bay. Sterling felt the machinery of his professional persona trying to engage, the practiced responses that would allow him to take control of this situation, to turn vulnerability into leverage. But something fundamental had shifted, and the old tools didn't seem to fit the new problem. He was being confronted not with a business challenge or a negotiation, but with the raw material of family trauma, with revelations that couldn't be managed through the usual strategies of power and position. The restaurant continued its operations around them, though Sterling was dimly aware that their table had become the epicenter of attention, that conversations at neighboring tables had shifted from their own concerns to speculation about the scene unfolding in their midst. He saw the manager approaching with security in tow, the cavalry arriving to restore order and remove the disruption, and Sterling raised a hand to stop them, a gesture that surprised himself as much as it seemed to surprise Frank O'Connor. "Give us a few minutes," Sterling said to the approaching staff, his voice somehow finding authority even as his internal landscape was collapsing into chaos. The manager hesitated, clearly torn between respecting a valued patron's wishes and maintaining the standards that kept people like Frank out of establishments like this, but ultimately deference to wealth won, and they retreated to a watchful distance, ready to intervene if the situation escalated. Sterling looked at Frank O'Connor with new attention, trying to reconcile the wreckage before him with the claim of brotherhood, searching for the thread of connection that would make this nightmare coherent. "If what you're saying is true," Sterling began, hating the conditional phrasing that acknowledged the possibility, "if you're really my father's son, then where have you been? Why have I never heard of you? Why would he keep your existence secret?" The questions tumbled out in a rush, each one carrying the weight of betrayal, the sense that his father's legacy was being retroactively contaminated by lies and omissions. Frank's expression shifted to something that might have been pain or might have been relief at finally being asked, at having the opportunity to tell a story that had been trapped inside him for decades. He reached into his coat again and pulled out an envelope, worn and handled, containing documents that Sterling recognized instantly as adoption papers, legal artifacts that formalized the transfer of one human life from one family structure to another. "Your father got a girl pregnant when he was 22, Frank said, laying out the papers with the careful precision of someone presenting evidence in a trial they'd been conducting in their head for years. "She was from the wrong background, the wrong social class, everything that made the relationship impossible in his family's eyes. When I was born, his parents gave him a choice: give the child up for adoption and continue with the life they'd planned for him, or keep the baby and lose everything, the family support, the inheritance, the business opportunities. He chose his future. He chose the empire he would build, the name he would make for himself. He chose everything that eventually became yours." The words were delivered without apparent anger, but Sterling heard the accumulated weight of them, the lifetime of being the cost of someone else's ambition, the price his father had paid for success measured in abandoned humanity. Sterling felt sick, physically ill with the implications, with the realization that his entire existence was built on a choice that required Frank's erasure. He stayed in touch at first, Frank continued, his fingers tracing the edges of the adoption papers with a familiarity that spoke of countless reviews, countless returns to this evidence of his origin story. "There are letters, photographs, birthday cards for the first few years. He loved me, Mr. Sterling. That's the cruelest part of all of this. He didn't abandon me because he didn't care. He abandoned me because he cared about other things more, about reputation, about the business he was building, about the life he was constructing with your mother. By the time you were born, I'd already been written out of the story, already been transformed from a son into a secret, from a person into a problem that had been solved through the proper legal channels." Sterling felt each word as an indictment not just of his father, but of the entire world he inhabited, the system that allowed people to be discarded when they became inconvenient, that permitted wealth to insulate itself from the consequences of its choices. He looked at Frank O'Connor and saw not just a homeless man, but a mirror, a reflection of what he himself might have become if fortune had distributed its favors differently, if the accidents of birth and acknowledgement had fallen another way. Chapter 4. The inheritance of absence. Sterling sat in silence that felt like drowning, his mind racing through memories and recontextualizing them in light of this new information, finding patterns he'd never noticed before in his father's behavior. The old man had been distant even when present, his attention always divided between the son he'd kept and the empire he was building, as if some part of him was perpetually elsewhere, haunted by choices that couldn't be unmade or forgotten. Sterling had interpreted that distance as the natural preoccupation of important men, had understood his father's absences as the price of significance, the sacrifice required of those who shaped industries and influenced markets. Now those same absences took on different meaning, became evidence of guilt and compartmentalization, the emotional architecture necessary to live with having discarded a child for the sake of ambition. Sterling felt a surge of anger at his father, betrayal mixing with the grief of discovering that the man he'd idealized was fundamentally different than the myth he'd internalized. "Why now?" Sterling asked, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't fully name. With the vertigo of having his foundation shaken, "Why come to me after all these years? What do you want from me?" The questions emerged more harshly than he intended, defensive mechanisms engaging even as he recognized the cruelty of asking a man who'd lost everything to justify his existence, to explain why he dared to disturb the comfortable ignorance of those who'd inherited what should have been shared. Frank looked at him with eyes that held decades of survival and something that might have been pity, recognition that Sterling was suffering a wound that Frank had already learned to live with, the knowledge that the people we come from are more complicated and more flawed than childhood needs them to be. The photograph sat between them on the table, a third presence in the conversation, silent evidence that demanded response. "I'm dying," Frank said, with the flat effect of someone who'd already processed the information and arrived at acceptance, the words carrying weight but no plea for sympathy. "Liver disease, probably from all the years of trying to forget who I was and where I came from. The doctors give me maybe 6 months, maybe less if I'm lucky, and it goes quick." Sterling felt his breath catch, felt the situation shifting again into territory he wasn't prepared to navigate, moving from abstract revelation to immediate human crisis. He looked at Frank O'Connor with new attention, seeing beneath the layers of weather and wear to the illness that was consuming him from the inside, the subtle yellowing of the skin that spoke of organs failing, of systems shutting down in the inexorable way bodies do when they've been pushed too far for too long. Death was approaching this man, had already sent its advanced scouts, and Sterling was being asked to bear witness to something he'd spent his life avoiding. "I spent years being angry at your father," Frank continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing, speaking with the clarity of someone who'd thought through these words countless times before having the opportunity to deliver them. "I hated him for choosing you over me, for building a life that didn't have room for the truth of my existence. I watched from the outside as he became successful, as his name went up on buildings and his face appeared in magazines, as he received awards for philanthropy and civic contribution while I was living in shelters and under bridges, trying to figure out how to survive another winter. I told myself that I didn't need his acknowledgement, that I was better off without the corruption of his world. But that was a lie I told myself to make the abandonment bearable, to transform rejection into something that looked like choice. The honesty was devastating, stripping away any pretense or protective distance, forcing Sterling to confront the human cost of his family's success. Sterling wanted to protest, to defend his father's memory against these accusations, to argue that circumstances were more complex than Frank's narrative allowed, but he couldn't find the words because somewhere deep in his understanding he recognized the truth of what was being said. His father had been capable of tremendous generosity and equally tremendous cruelty, had built monuments to compassion while being ruthless in business, had loved his legitimate family while erasing the evidence of his earlier mistakes. That duality had always been there, visible in the way the old man could be warm with Sterling while being coldly efficient with employees, could write checks to charitable causes while showing no mercy to competitors. Sterling had inherited that duality, had learned to compartmentalize his own empathy, to separate the personal from the professional, to maintain boundaries that allowed him to be kind in some contexts and ruthless in others. Looking at Frank, he was being confronted with the ultimate expression of that compartmentalization, with what happened when someone was categorized as expendable. "I don't want your money," Frank said, and the statement carried such conviction that Sterling believed it despite every instinct that told him everyone wanted something, that all interactions were ultimately transactional. "I've lived this long without the fortune that should have been mine. I've learned to survive on the margins, to find meaning in places your world doesn't recognize as valuable. What I want, what I came here to ask for before I run out of time, is acknowledgement. I want you to know that I existed, that I'm real, that your father's story isn't complete without the parts he tried to erase. I want to exist in someone's memory as more than a mistake that was corrected, more than a problem that was solved through adoption papers and strategic forgetting." The request was somehow both simple and impossibly complex, asking for something that cost nothing and everything simultaneously, demanding that Sterling allow his understanding of his own history to be permanently altered, to carry the weight of Frank's existence forward into whatever time remained. Sterling looked at his half-brother, and the term felt foreign and true in equal measure, a linguistic bridge across a chasm of experience and circumstance, and felt something fundamental shifting in his chest, some locked chamber opening despite his attempts to keep it sealed. He thought about the man he'd become, about the values he claimed to hold, even as he spent his days in the ruthless pursuit of accumulation and influence, about the distance between the person he presented to the world and the person he was when stripped of title and status. Frank O'Connor was offering him an opportunity disguised as a burden, the chance to be something his father hadn't been, to make a choice that prioritized human connection over the protection of comfortable fictions. Sterling felt terrified of that opportunity, of what it would cost him to acknowledge this truth, of how it would complicate the narrative he'd constructed about himself and his family. But he also felt something else emerging beneath the fear, something that might have been relief, the exhausted gratitude that comes when hiding becomes too expensive to maintain. Segi Zan Chapter 5, The Cost of Comfort. The restaurant had become a stage where Sterling's entire conception of himself was being dismantled and reconstructed in real time, each revelation from Frank O'Connor functioning like a surgical instrument, cutting away layers of assumption and certainty. Sterling's food sat untouched, gone cold in its artistic arrangement, a monument to the interrupted evening that had transformed from routine into crisis. He found himself studying Frank's face with an intensity that bordered on desperation, searching for traces of their father in the weathered features, finding them in ways that made denial impossible, even as his mind continued to generate objections and alternative explanations. The resemblance was there in the bone structure, in the particular shape of the earlobes, in small gestures that echoed patterns Sterling recognized from his own movements and from photographs of their father in moments when the mask of public performance had slipped. "Tell me about your life," Sterling said, the request emerging from some impulse he didn't fully understand, a need to fill in the blank spaces of this stranger's existence, to transform abstraction into narrative. Frank looked surprised by the question, as if he'd expected continued resistance rather than curiosity, as if the possibility of genuine interest in his story seemed too improbable to prepare for. A flicker of emotion crossed his face, something that might have been gratitude or might have been grief at all the years when no one had asked, when his existence had been something to be managed or avoided rather than understood. He settled back in his chair with visible effort, his body showing signs of the illness consuming him, the simple act of sitting upright requiring energy he was running out of. "I grew up in a series of foster homes," Frank began, his voice taking on the quality of someone reciting facts they'd long ago learned to deliver without drowning in the emotional weight of them. The adoption never really took, never became the permanent placement everyone hoped it would be. I was returned more than once, like merchandise that didn't meet expectations. By the time I was 12, I'd learned that I was fundamentally unwanted, that there was something about me that made me impossible to keep. I spent my teenage years bouncing between families who took me in for the state payments and group homes where survival was the only curriculum that mattered. I got into drugs early, found that chemicals could fill the space where belonging should have been, could make the absence feel like choice rather than rejection. Sterling listened with a growing sense of horror, recognizing that every comfort of his own childhood, the stability, the resources, the unquestioned sense of having a place in the world, had been things Frank was systematically denied. The trajectory Frank described was familiar in its outline. The predictable cascade of consequences that followed from initial trauma and lack of support, the way society's systems seemed designed to perpetuate disadvantage rather than interrupt it. Frank had cycled through addiction and recovery multiple times, had held jobs and lost them, had experienced brief periods of stability, followed by longer stretches of homelessness and desperation. He spoke about these experiences with the detachment that Sterling recognized as protective mechanism, the necessary distance required to examine one's own suffering without being consumed by it. Throughout the recitation, Sterling kept thinking about the alternate reality where his father had made different choices, where Frank had been acknowledged and included, where the family fortune had been divided differently from the beginning. The contrast between what had been and what might have been felt like an indictment of every structure and value Sterling had taken for granted. "I tried to contact your father several times over the years," Frank continued, his hands moving restlessly over the surface of the table, fingers tracing invisible patterns that might have been maps or might have been attempts at self-soothing. "I wrote letters that were returned unopened, showed up at his office building and was turned away by security, called phone numbers that led to assistants trained to filter out unwanted voices. Each rejection confirmed what I'd always suspected, that my existence was an embarrassment he'd rather forget, that acknowledging me would complicate the clean narrative of his success. When he died, I thought about going to the funeral, about forcing my way into that church and making everyone acknowledge that he had another son, a secret he'd kept buried. But I didn't. I stayed away, let him have his perfect send-off, let you and your mother grieve without my complications. That restraint cost me something, that final act of consideration for people who'd never considered me." Sterling felt each word as an accusation and an invitation, a challenge to decide what kind of person he would choose to be in response to information that changed everything. His phone had been vibrating throughout the conversation with messages and calls he was ignoring, the normal demands of his existence continuing while his internal world was being restructured. He thought about the foundation gala next week, about standing at a podium and speaking about his father's legacy of giving, about philanthropic commitment and civic responsibility, and the hypocrisy of it threatened to choke him. How could he celebrate a man who'd abandoned his own child, who'd prioritized reputation over recognition, who'd built monuments to generosity while maintaining such calculated cruelty in his personal life? Yet how could he publicly dismantle his father's memory without destroying the foundation, both literal and metaphorical, that Sterling's own life was built upon? "I'm sorry," Sterling said, and the words felt simultaneously inadequate and necessary, a starting point rather than a conclusion. "I'm sorry that you lived through that you were discarded and forgotten, that the family who should have claimed you chose comfort over connection. I'm sorry that my existence was purchased at the cost of your erasure, that I inherited everything while you inherited nothing." Frank's expression shifted at the apology, something hardening and softening simultaneously, as if he'd waited so long to hear words like these that their actual arrival triggered complicated responses beyond simple gratitude. Sterling realized that sorry was perhaps the easiest thing to say and the hardest thing to mean, that apologizing for structural injustice didn't undo the damage or restore what had been lost, but might begin the process of acknowledging that damage as real and wrong. The silence between them took on new texture, no longer the adversarial standoff of their initial encounter, but something more like the exhausted quiet after confession, both men sitting with truths that couldn't be unsaid or unfelt. Sterling looked around the restaurant and saw it differently now, saw the wealth and privilege not as reward for merit, but as lottery of circumstance, understood that his table and Frank's streets were separated not by virtue, but by accident of acknowledgement, by which child got to be recognized and which got erased. He felt simultaneously guilty for what he'd been given and defensive about suggesting he'd done anything wrong by being born into the accepted category. The complexity of it all pressed against him, refusing to resolve into simple answers or clear courses of action, demanding instead that he sit with discomfort and uncertainty, that he allow himself to be changed by information he hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. Chapter 6. The Mathematics of Family. Sterling's mind kept returning to practical questions, even as his emotional landscape remained in chaos. The trained problem-solving instinct of his professional life trying to find purchase on a situation that resisted familiar frameworks. He wanted to verify Frank's claims, to subject the story to the rigorous scrutiny he'd apply to any business proposition, to protect himself from manipulation, even as something deeper in him recognized the verification impulse as a form of distancing, a way to transform overwhelming human complexity into manageable data points. He looked at Frank O'Connor and saw both authenticity and the terrible possibility that authenticity might be weaponized, that need and truth could be deployed strategically by someone who'd learned to survive through whatever means available. The cynicism felt ugly even as Sterling couldn't fully relinquish it, couldn't silence the voice that had been trained to suspect everyone's motives and interrogate every claim. "I'll need to see more evidence," Sterling said, trying to make the statement sound less like accusation than acknowledgement of due diligence, though he suspected Frank heard it as the former, regardless of his intentions. "The photograph is compelling, but it's not conclusive. I'll need documentation, medical records that prove the biological connection, testimonies from people who knew about the situation at the time. You understand that I can't simply accept your word on something this significant, something that changes everything about how I understand my family history." Frank nodded slowly, the gesture carrying neither surprise nor offense, as if he'd anticipated this response and had already made peace with the necessity of proof. He reached into his coat once more, the gesture becoming familiar now, each entry into those layered pockets producing new fragments of a hidden history, and pulled out a folder that looked to have been assembled with care, documents organized and preserved despite the chaos of the life that had carried them. Inside were layers of evidence that would take hours to properly examine. But Sterling could see enough to recognize their potential legitimacy. Hospital records from Frank's birth, listing their father's name as parent, letters written in handwriting Sterling recognized from saved correspondence, photographs spanning years showing the progression of a relationship that had existed in secret. There were birthday cards signed with their father's distinctive signature, Christmas presents documented in Polaroids, evidence of a connection that had persisted for several years before being severed completely. Sterling felt his defenses weakening as he sorted through the materials, each document adding weight to Frank's claims, building a case that became harder to dismiss as fabrication or delusion. The handwriting alone was damning, carrying the particular flourishes their father had used, the distinctive way he formed certain letters that would be nearly impossible to forge, convincingly. Sterling found himself holding a birthday card addressed to my dear son Frank, and dated 3 years before Sterling's own birth, the inscription speaking of love and regret in equal measure, promising visits that may or may not have materialized. "There's more," Frank said quietly, watching Sterling's face as he processed the accumulating evidence, observing the transformation from skepticism to reluctant acceptance. "I hired a lawyer about 6 months ago when I got the diagnosis and realized I was running out of time. He helped me gather what we'd need for legal recognition, did the research into inheritance law and what rights I might have to contest your father's will. I'm not showing you this to threaten you, Mr. Sterling. I'm showing you because I want you to understand that I've done my homework, that I'm not some delusional vagrant making up stories for attention or advantage. Every claim I'm making can be substantiated. Every part of my story can be verified if you choose to invest the effort." Sterling felt a strange mixture of relief and dread at this information, grateful for the systematic approach, while terrified of what legal proceedings might mean for his family's reputation and his own position within the company his father had built. The implications were staggering when Sterling allowed himself to think through them fully, to consider what Frank's legal recognition would mean, not just emotionally but practically, financially, structurally. If Frank was indeed their father's firstborn son, if the adoption hadn't severed all legal ties in the ways Sterling's lawyers would need to investigate, then the entire estate might need to be reconsidered, the inheritance recalculated, the clean succession Sterling had assumed was his, by right revealed as contingent and contested. He thought about the company's board of directors, about shareholders and stakeholders who believed in stability and clear lines of authority, about how Frank's emergence would introduce chaos into carefully constructed systems of governance and control. Sterling's position had always felt secure, precisely because it was singular, because he was the only heir, the unambiguous inheritor of both fortune and responsibility. Frank's existence shattered that singularity, transformed Sterling from the sole son into one of two, from complete inheritor to partial claimant. "I need time," Sterling said, the words emerging as both plea and command, an attempt to reassert some control over a situation that had spun far beyond his ability to manage. It's overwhelming. I need to process what you've told me, to verify the documentation, to figure out what this means for everything. Can you give me that? Can we meet again in a few days after I've had a chance to think and to consult with people who can help me understand the legal implications? Frank looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Something that might have been disappointment at the delay, or might have been understanding that complex information required time to integrate. Sterling realized he was asking for patience from a man who was dying, who'd already waited decades for acknowledgement, who was measuring his remaining time in months rather than years. The cruelty of asking Frank to wait longer pressed against Sterling's conscience, but he genuinely didn't know how to respond immediately, didn't have the emotional or practical infrastructure to make decisions of this magnitude without reflection and advice. "I've waited this long," Frank said finally, his voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond physical illness. A weariness that spoke to the accumulated burden of being erased and forgotten. "I can wait a few more days. But I need you to understand something, Mr. Sterling. I'm not going to disappear conveniently. I'm not going to accept money to sign away my claims and vanish back into the streets where your world doesn't have to see me. I'm past the point where comfort matters more than truth, where survival instinct overrides the need to be acknowledged as real. Whatever time I have left, I'm going to spend it as your father's son, whether that's officially recognized or not. You can fight me in court, you can try to discredit my evidence, you can deploy all the resources and power at your disposal to maintain the fiction that I don't exist. But you'll know the truth, and you'll have to live with whatever choices you make in response to that knowledge." Sterling nodded, accepting the terms of engagement that Frank was establishing, recognizing that this wasn't a negotiation he could win through traditional strategies of leverage and pressure. They exchanged contact information, Frank providing a shelter address and a cell phone number that surprised Sterling with its existence, another reminder that homelessness in contemporary society was more complex than the simplified stereotypes allowed. Sterling watched as Frank carefully returned the documents to his coat, the folder disappearing back into the layers that had protected it through seasons and circumstances, and felt a surge of something that might have been protectiveness or might have been fear at the fragility of this evidence, at how easily it could be lost or destroyed. He found himself wanting to offer Frank money despite the earlier refusal, wanting to do something concrete to address the visible need, even as he understood that material assistance might feel like an attempt to buy resolution to a problem that couldn't be solved through transaction. They stood simultaneously, an unspoken agreement that the conversation had reached its natural endpoint, that anything more said tonight would be redundant or overwhelming. Sterling extended his hand automatically, the gesture of business conclusion, and felt Frank's grip in return, rough and damaged from exposure, but carrying surprising strength, the handshake of someone who'd survived through resilience rather than comfort. As Frank turned to leave, Sterling found himself saying, "Wait," the word emerging before he'd fully decided what he wanted to communicate, driven by instinct rather than strategy. Frank paused, looking back with an expression that held hope and guardedness in equal measure, waiting to hear what Sterling would offer. "I believe you," Sterling said, the admission costing something to speak aloud but feeling necessary, a first step toward whatever transformation this encounter was demanding of him. "I don't know what that means yet, what I'm going to do with that belief. But I wanted you to know before you leave that I believe your story is true." Chapter 7. The Reconstruction of Memory. Sterling remained in the restaurant long after Frank departed, sitting alone at his table while the staff moved around him with careful discretion, recognizing that something significant had occurred, even if they didn't understand its nature. He stared at his phone without really seeing it, his mind replaying the conversation in fragments, trying to organize information that resisted coherent arrangement, that kept shifting between emotional and practical registers without settling into either. The other diners had returned to their own concerns, the brief drama of Frank's appearance already fading into background noise, but Sterling felt marked by the encounter, felt as though everyone should be able to see that he'd been fundamentally altered, even though his exterior remained unchanged. He picked up his wine glass and found the contents had gone warm and unpalatable, a small detail that somehow registered as profound, as symbolic of everything that had been disrupted and couldn't be restored to its previous state. His first instinct was to call his lawyers, to begin the process of verification and damage control, to deploy the defensive mechanisms that protected people like him from people like Frank. But he sat with that impulse without acting on it, recognizing it as reflexive rather than considered, an automatic response that might not serve what this situation actually required. Sterling thought about his father, trying to reconcile the man he'd known, or thought he'd known, with someone capable of the choices Frank's existence represented. The old man had spoken often about integrity, about the importance of keeping one's word and honoring commitments, about the responsibility that came with privilege and position. Those speeches took on different resonance now, revealed themselves as either hypocrisy or evidence of hard-won understanding. Lessons learned from failures the speaker had never publicly acknowledged. Sterling wondered if his father had thought about Frank in his final days, if guilt had surfaced as death approached and stripped away the protective layers of rationalization. The memory of his father's death arrived unbidden, those final weeks in the hospital when the old man had grown smaller and more vulnerable, when the force of his personality had gradually dimmed beneath the assault of disease and medication. Sterling had sat beside the bed for hours, holding conversations that meandered between lucidity and confusion, listening to stories he'd heard before, mixed with fragments that made no sense, names he didn't recognize, and references to events that seemed to belong to someone else's life. He'd attributed those disconnected moments to the morphine, to the brain's deterioration under the assault of pain and treatment. But now, he wondered if some of those cryptic statements had been about Frank, about the son who'd been erased, but never entirely forgotten. There had been a moment, Sterling remembered now with new clarity, when his father had gripped his hand with unexpected strength and said something about forgiveness, about sins that couldn't be undone but might be acknowledged, about carrying truth forward when he was gone. Sterling had thought the old man was speaking abstractly, offering general wisdom about life and mortality, but perhaps he'd been trying to make a confession that Sterling hadn't been equipped to hear. Sterling pulled out his phone and opened the photo gallery, scrolling back through years of images to find photographs of his father, studying them with new attention now that he knew about Frank's existence. He saw the resemblance more clearly now, the genetic patterns that connected all three of them across their different lives and circumstances, the family traits that transcended individual fortune or misfortune. In one photograph from a company event, his father stood at a podium, receiving an award for philanthropic contribution, smiling with the confident satisfaction of someone whose public narrative was secure and celebrated, and Sterling felt a wave of anger at the performance of it all, at the gap between image and reality that Frank's abandoned existence represented. But the anger was complicated by something else, by recognition that he himself had inherited not just money, but the entire architecture of concealment, the skill at maintaining appearances while hiding uncomfortable truths, the ability to compartmentalize morality into categories that served convenience rather than consistency. His phone rang, breaking the spiral of his thoughts, his assistant's name appearing on the screen with reminders about meetings tomorrow and decisions that needed to be made tonight. Sterling ignored the call, letting it roll to voicemail, suddenly unable to engage with the normal demands of his existence when everything felt provisional and uncertain. He thought about the office he'd return to tomorrow, about the nameplate on his desk that read Chief Executive Officer, about the authority that title conferred and the responsibilities it entailed. That position had always felt like destiny fulfilled, the natural endpoint of being his father's son, the role he'd been raised to occupy. Now it felt like inheritance stolen, like position secured through the systematic erasure of competing claims, like power that was only his because someone else had been prevented from claiming their share. Sterling understood intellectually that Frank's existence didn't necessarily diminish his own achievements, that he'd worked hard and made his own contributions to the company's success, But emotionally, he couldn't shake the sense that everything was tainted, that his entire life was built on a foundation of injustice he'd been benefiting from without knowing it. The restaurant manager approached carefully, clearly hoping to close out Sterling's table without causing offense. The gentle pressure of someone trying to reclaim space without directly demanding it. Sterling looked up at him and saw a stranger performing a role, following scripts of service and deference that suddenly felt absurd in the face of what he'd just learned about truth and concealment, about the performance of normalcy that all of society depended upon. He signed the check without reviewing it, adding a tip that was probably either too generous or not generous enough, because he'd lost all sense of proportion, all ability to calculate what was appropriate when his entire framework for measuring value had been disrupted. As he stood to leave, Sterling found himself looking around the restaurant one more time, trying to commit the space to memory, recognizing that this was the last moment of his old life, that walking out those doors would be crossing a threshold into territory he couldn't fully map or predict. The Chicago streets were alive with evening activity, people moving with purpose and destination, lives unfolding according to their own narratives and urgencies. Sterling walked without clear direction, his usual driver waiting somewhere with the car, but Sterling not ready to return to the insulated comfort of chauffeured transportation, needing the friction of sidewalks and crowds to help process what had happened. He passed by people experiencing homelessness in doorways and under overpasses, people he'd trained himself not to really see, to register only peripherally as part of the urban landscape, rather than as individuals with their own complex histories. Now he looked at each person wondering if they'd been someone's child, someone's sibling, wondering what choices and circumstances had placed them outside the protected zones of society. He thought about Frank O'Connor spending years in this condition, existing in this provisional space where survival was never guaranteed and dignity was constantly under assault, and felt shame at his own earlier dismissal, at the casual cruelty of "get a job," as if employment was the simple solution to structural abandonment. Chapter 8. The Choice of Acknowledgement. Sterling found himself at the lakefront, drawn by some instinct toward water and open space, needing the perspective that came from standing at the edge of something vast and indifferent. The lights of the city reflected on the surface of Lake Michigan, creating patterns that shifted with the movement of waves, beauty that existed independent of human drama and complication. He stood there for a long time, letting the wind push against him, letting the cold work its way through his expensive coat, wanting to feel something physical and immediate that might ground him in his body when his mind kept spiraling into abstract territory. Joggers passed by on their evening runs, couples walked hand in hand, life continuing in its mundane particulars, while Sterling's internal landscape underwent reconstruction. He thought about all the choices that had led to this moment, not just his father's decisions decades ago, but his own recent actions. The dismissal of Frank at the restaurant, the automatic cruelty that had emerged before he'd known who he was rejecting. The realization arrived that Frank was right. Sterling had become his father in more ways than he'd acknowledged, had internalized not just business strategies, but moral frameworks, had learned to separate people into categories of relevant and irrelevant, worthy and unworthy of consideration. He'd built his success partly on that ability to see some people as fully human and complex, while reducing others to obstacles or opportunities, to maintain boundaries that protected his comfort from confrontation with consequences. Frank's appearance had forced those boundaries to collapse, had made Sterling see that the stranger he'd dismissed was connected to him by bonds that predated and superseded social position, that biology and family history created obligations that couldn't be dissolved through convenient ignorance. The question now was whether that seeing would translate into different action, whether recognition would lead to transformation or merely to guilt that changed nothing about how he moved through the world. Sterling pulled out his phone and opened a browser, searching for information about inheritance law, about adopted children's rights, about what Frank might be legally entitled to if he chose to pursue formal claims. The search results painted a complex picture, suggesting that outcomes would depend on specifics of timing and jurisdiction, on whether the adoption had fully severed parental rights or had been structured in ways that preserved certain legal connections. Sterling felt himself slipping into analytical mode, treating the situation as a problem to be researched and solved, and had to consciously pull back from that instinct, recognizing that reducing Frank to a legal challenge was another form of erasure, another way of avoiding the human reality of what was being demanded. What Frank wanted wasn't primarily about money or inheritance, though those practical matters would need to be addressed. What he wanted was the thing Sterling had been given automatically by accident of birth: recognition, acknowledgement, the simple validation of existing in someone's story as significant rather than erased. The choice Sterling faced was fundamentally about what kind of person he would allow himself to become in response to information that rewrote his understanding of his own origin and position. He could deploy resources to fight Frank's claims, could build legal and public relations strategies to protect the family reputation and his own uncontested inheritance, could treat this as a crisis to be managed rather than a truth to be integrated. That path was available, would find support from lawyers and advisors who specialized in protecting wealth from complications, who would frame Frank as a threat to be neutralized rather than a human being to be acknowledged. Sterling understood that impulse, felt its pull, recognized how much easier his life would be if he could return to the comfortable ignorance that had existed before Frank placed that photograph on his table. But he also understood that ease was its own kind of death, that comfort purchased through willful blindness came at a cost to something essential in himself. The alternative path was less clear, more frightening in its ambiguity and potential consequences. Sterling could choose to acknowledge Frank publicly, to integrate him into the family narrative, to reconsider the distribution of inheritance in ways that recognized both sons rather than privileging the one who'd been kept over, the one who'd been abandoned. That choice would bring complications Sterling could barely begin to imagine: board reactions, media scrutiny, legal challenges from stakeholders who'd assumed Sterling's sole inheritance was secure and unchallenged. It would mean rewriting not just his father's legacy, but his own identity, accepting that he was part of a more complex family story than the clean succession narrative he'd been living within. But it would also mean choosing integrity over convenience, choosing to be someone who responded to truth with courage rather than someone who protected himself through strategic denial. Sterling thought about his father's famous speeches about responsibility and ethics, about all the times the old man had spoken about the duty that came with privilege, and recognized that this was the test of whether those values meant anything beyond performance. He made the decision standing there at the lakefront, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual acknowledgement of what had been true since the moment Frank placed that photograph on the table. That he couldn't unknow what he'd learned, couldn't return to the simpler story, couldn't be the person who'd sat down to dinner in that restaurant. Sterling pulled out his phone and composed a message to his assistant, asking her to clear his schedule for the next week and to arrange a meeting with the family's lawyers, not for defensive strategy, but for figuring out how to properly recognize Frank's claims and integrate him into the estate discussions. He sent a second message directly to Frank at the number they'd exchanged, asking if they could meet again soon, saying there were things Sterling wanted to discuss about how to move forward, The sending of those messages felt like crossing a line, like making a commitment that would reshape everything that followed, and Sterling felt simultaneously terrified and relieved to have made the choice. The walk back to where his driver waited was long, giving Sterling time to think through implications and consequences, to begin imagining what the next weeks and months would look like as this truth became public and integrated. He thought about the Foundation Gala, about whether he should cancel his appearance or use it as an opportunity to tell a more complete story about his father's life, to acknowledge mistakes alongside achievements. He thought about Frank dying in 6 months or less, about the urgency that knowledge created, about the fact that any reconciliation or acknowledgement had to happen quickly or not at all. He thought about his own eventual death, about what story would be told about him when that time came, about whether he would be remembered as someone who'd perpetuated his father's erasures or someone who'd had the courage to correct them. The questions didn't have easy answers, but Sterling felt certain now that asking them was necessary, that the discomfort of confronting these complications was the work required of him. As Sterling approached his car, he saw his reflection in the tinted windows, a man in an expensive coat, looking like any other successful executive leaving a long day. But he knew he was different now, marked by information that couldn't be discarded or ignored. The driver opened the door with the usual deferential greeting, and Sterling slid into the familiar comfort of the leather interior. But it felt different now, felt like a space that belonged to someone he was leaving behind, rather than someone he was continuing to be. He gave his home address and settled back, watching the city pass outside the windows, seeing it as Frank might see it, from the outside looking in at worlds that seemed designed to keep certain people permanently elsewhere. Sterling understood now that acknowledgement wasn't a single act, but an ongoing choice, that recognizing Frank wouldn't be complete with legal documents and inheritance adjustments, that it would require learning to see the world differently, to understand his own position as contingent and unearned rather than natural and deserved. The lights of his building appeared ahead, rising into the night sky with the confident assertion of architectural ambition, and Sterling prepared to enter that space carrying knowledge that would transform how he inhabited it. He thought about Frank spending tonight in a shelter or on the street, thought about the profound inequality of their different destinations after sharing blood and a father, and felt the weight of that disparity as something he could no longer simply accept as the way things were. Tomorrow would bring complications, conversations with lawyers and board members, media strategies and family discussions, all the practical machinery of integrating a hidden truth into public narratives. But tonight, Sterling carried something simpler and more fundamental, the recognition that his brother existed, that Frank O'Connor was real, that acknowledgement was possible even when it came decades late and complicated everything. That recognition wouldn't undo the years of Frank's suffering or restore what had been lost, but it was the beginning of something different, the first step toward being someone Sterling might eventually be able to respect when he looked at his own reflection. And in the end, that possibility of becoming someone worthy of the values he claimed to hold felt more valuable than any inheritance, more necessary than any protected comfort, more true than any story that required Frank's continued erasure to maintain its coherence.